Imagine for a second that you are sitting in a dark theater,
Yeah.
watching a movie. You think you're seeing this continuous fluid motion, like a car speeding down a highway or a person waving their hand.
Right. It feels completely seamless.
Exactly. But you are actually seeing that. You are looking at thousands of static individual still frames flashing by, just flashing by so quickly that your brain stitches them together into reality.
And that fluid motion is entirely generated by you. It is just a phenomenal sleight of hand. I mean, the continuity feels so absolute, so undeniably real, that we never really stop to question the fragmented nature of the underlying data.
Yeah, and that precise tension between the seamless world we perceive and the actual underlying architecture of reality, that's what we are tracking down today.
It is a massive topic.
It really is. So we are pulling together this huge stack of sources to uncover a staggeringly consistent common pattern across human history.
Yeah.
We're looking at, cutting-edge cognitive neuroscience papers on predictive coding.
Alongside ancient metaphysical texts like the Upanishads and the Kabbalion.
Right. And modern clinical mindfulness manuals, and even the teachings of medieval mystics. Because despite thousands of years of separation and completely different vocabularies, every single one of these sources points to the exact same architecture of human suffering.
And crucially, they map out the exact same mechanism for human freedom. The through line here is just remarkable.
By the time we finish this deep dive, you're going to see a direct mechanical link between how ancient philosophers described the illusion of the ego and how modern algorithms map the brain's computational errors.
Yeah, we are basically tracing how spiritual detachment and neurobiological efficiency are, well, they're essentially two different languages describing the exact same human capability.
So we need to start with this foundational premise that shows up across all these esoteric texts, the concept of illusion. The argument that this world of multiplicity, division, friction, the stuff you and I experience every single day, is not the ultimate reality.
Right, and to really understand the mechanics of this, we have to look at classical Indian metaphysics, specifically an 8th century philosopher named Gaudapada.
Okay, Gaudapada.
Yeah, he was the foundational architect of the Advaita Vedanta tradition, which is a school of absolute non-dualism. And Gaudapada wasn't just saying, everything is connected. He formulated a much more radical doctrine called Ajativada.
Ajativada. What does that mean exactly?
It translates to the theory of non-origination.
Meaning what nothing is ever actually created.
Basically, yes.
That seems totally counterintuitive, though. I mean, I can look out the window right now and see new buildings going up, or watch a plant grow from a seed.
It does seem contradictory, but his argument shifts the burden of proof from the physical universe to the perceiver. The fundamental premise of Ajativada is that the ultimate reality is just pure, unconditioned, undifferentiated consciousness.
So it's just one unbroken thing.
Exactly. It doesn't have parts. It doesn't change. Therefore, nothing is ever truly born or created into separate, fragmented pieces.
But I perceive separate, fragmented pieces. I mean, I see you, I see the table, I see a tree outside. How does he account for the pluralistic world if reality is just an undivided whole?
He argues that the multiplicity you perceive is entirely a vibration of the mind.
A vibration.
Yeah, the Sanskrit term he uses is manaspandita, and he illustrates this with a concept called alata shanti, or the quenching of the firebrand.
Okay, what is a firebrand?
Just a glowing stick of wood. If you take this glowing stick and wave it rapidly in the dark, it creates the visual appearance of a continuous glowing circle of light in the air.
Oh, right, like the persistence of vision, like when you wave a sparkler around.
Precisely. But there is no actual circle of light, is there? There is only a single point of fire in motion.
Huh.
When the stick stops moving, the circle vanishes. It didn't come from anywhere, it didn't go anywhere, it was merely an appearance generated by motion. And Gaudapada argues that the entire universe of dualities, subject and object, the knower and the known, good and bad, is exactly like that circle.
Wow.
It's an appearance generated by the vibration of consciousness. When the perceiving mind is stilled, the illusion of multiplicity vanishes, leaving only that single point of reality.
I mean, I struggle with this a bit because if reality is this unified, continuous stream, what is the motor spinning the stick? Like, why am I trapped inside this vibration of multiplicity?
That is the logical next question, and Sikh philosophy provides a very specific architectural answer to that.
Okay, let's unpack that.
So the Sikh tradition centers on a concept called Ik Onkar, which means a systematic dynamic unity, one supreme undivided reality. But to explain why we don't naturally perceive that unity, they introduce the mechanism of homai.
Which usually gets translated as the I, me ego, right?
It is the ego, yeah. But we need to think of it not just as arrogance, it's a cognitive lens of separation. Hama is the boundary maker.
The boundary maker.
Right. It takes a unified, continuous reality and artificially fractures it into dualistic states of being. It creates the concepts of rich and poor, sacred and profane, me and you.
So it's essentially just an informational filter.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. As long as you are processing the world through the lens of Hamai, non-dualism remains an abstract theory. You perceive a fractured world because your perceiving apparatus is fundamentally fractured.
Right.
And maintaining that boundary, constantly defining where I end and the universe begins, that requires an immense amount of cognitive energy.
Let's make this tangible. Because if Hamai is just a filter, taking a unified reality and chopping it into dualities, how does that actually play out in human experience?
Well, the Hermetic texts in our stack tackle this beautifully.
Specifically the Kybalion, right? They look at how the mind categorizes data.
Exactly. The Kybalion introduces the principle of polarity. The text states that everything is dual, everything has poles, but the crucial insight is that opposites are actually the exact same thing, merely experienced at varying degrees.
They use the example of temperature, don't they?
Yes. You experience hot and cold as complete opposites. But cold is not an independent physical force, it is just the absence of heat.
They're both just different degrees of atomic vibration.
Right. And if we elevate that to informational theory, the Kybalion is pointing out a massive cognitive shortcut humans use. Reality presents us with a continuous, infinite spectrum of data, like those infinite variations of temperature.
But the human brain can't process infinity.
No, not efficiently. So it artificially categorizes that continuous data stream into binary models. It creates hot and cold. It creates love and hate. Hate isn't a separate force from love. They are both a relationship of intense focus and attachment to an object, just vibrating at different frequencies.
We chop the spectrum into binaries for cognitive efficiency.
Exactly.
But see, this raises a massive red flag for me. If reality is truly a unified, continuous stream of data, why is my baseline biological setting to chop it up into these binary pieces? Evolutionarily speaking, would perceiving reality accurately be a much better survival strategy than walking around hallucinating divisions that don't exist?
Well, you would think so, but from a purely metabolic standpoint, perceiving objective reality is far too expensive.
Too expensive in terms of brain energy.
Yes. And this is where we cross the bridge from ancient metaphysics into modern cognitive neuroscience. The biological mirror to everything we just discussed is a framework called predictive processing, pioneered by the neuroscientist Carl Friston through what he calls the free energy principle.
Okay, let's dive into Friston's model. How does the brain actually engage with the world if it's not just passively taking in accurate data?
Historically, the scientific consensus viewed the brain as a passive receiver. You look at a tree, photons hit your retina, the signal travels up the optic nerve, and your brain pieces it together to say, ah, a tree.
Right, bottom-up processing.
Exactly. But predictive processing argues the exact inverse. Your brain is locked inside a dark, silent skull. It has absolutely no direct access to the outside world. To survive, it acts as a prediction machine.
It's constantly guessing what's out there.
It generates top-down hypotheses. It builds an internal simulated model of reality and continuously beams predictions down to your sensory organs about what they are about to experience before the experience even happens.
Wait, really? Before it happens?
Yes. It does this to mathematically minimize surprise, or what Friston calls free energy.
Let's define free energy here for a second, because it's not about crystals or aura reading. In this context, free energy is essentially unresolved informational entropy, right? Chaos, uncertainty.
Yes, precisely. In thermodynamics, free energy is the energy available to do work. But in information theory, which Friston applies to the brain, free energy is a measure of uncertainty or surprise.
Okay.
Biological systems are driven to resist entropy, to keep their internal states within very narrow, predictable bounds. If your brain can perfectly predict its environment, it minimizes surprise, it reduces informational entropy, and it conserves metabolic energy. So it builds a highly simplified binary model of the world, because a complex unified reality is mathematically too difficult to predict.
Okay, so the brain is basically acting like a highly prejudiced judge in a courtroom. The judge has already decided the verdict, that's the top-down prediction, before the trial even starts.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
He doesn't want to listen to the actual evidence, the bottom-up sensory input, because processing new evidence takes too much time and energy. He just wants the witnesses to say exactly what he expects them to say so he can close the case and go to lunch.
Right. The brain desperately wants the bottom-up sensory data to simply confirm the top-down verdict it has already written.
But what happens when the witness goes off script? What happens when the biological reality of the world does not match the brain's stubborn prediction?
Well, the judge throws a tantrum.
Naturally.
In neurobiological terms, the brain generates a prediction error. When there is a mismatch between the internal model and the external data, the brain produces an error signal. That signal travels back up the hierarchy, forcing the brain to either update its internal model or, more often, forcing the individual to act on the world to make it match the prediction.
And looking at the clinical data in our sources, this mechanism maps flawlessly onto psychological distress.
It is the root of it. Let's examine anxiety disorders through this lens. Anxiety is characterized by overly precise, intensely rigid prior beliefs about threat. The internal model strongly predicts danger.
Right.
So when an anxious person encounters a completely safe, ambiguous stimulus, the sensory data doesn't match the terrifying verdict the judge already wrote.
The brain is expecting a tiger, but it gets a gentle breeze.
Exactly. The mismatch is extreme. Because the prior belief is so rigid, the brain ignores the safe sensory data and generates a massive, painful prediction error. The person experiences severe distress, not because the world is dangerous, but because the world refuses to validate their brain's hallucinated model of danger.
Oh, wow. So they're basically suffering from their own internal simulation.
Precisely. And depression operates on the same architectural flaw. It involves an excessive reliance on rigid, negative prior beliefs. The depressed brain becomes trapped in a closed loop, placing vastly more weight on its own dark internal predictions than on any positive sensory evidence coming in from the outside world.
So, synthesizing this, when the ancient mystic texts say the world of suffering is an illusion generated by the mind, the manus bandita, the vibration of Hamai modern neuroscience is confirming that biologically. Your brain is hallucinating its reality based on pre-written models.
Exactly.
The suffering you feel is, quite literally, the neurobiological friction of a prediction error. It is your ego, your internal model, violently resisting the sensory reality of the present moment.
That is the staggering common pattern. The spiritual concept of the ego and the neurobiological concept of the predictive model are functionally identical.
Which brings us to the turning point of this deep dive. If my brain is a prejudiced judge throwing gavels at the wall every time reality doesn't match his pre-written verdict, how do I stop the tantrum?
How do you fire the judge?
Exactly. How do I fire the judge? Both the esoteric texts and modern clinical psychology prescribe the same universal antidote here.
Yes, the antidote is mindfulness. But we must define mindfulness very precisely here, not as a, wellness buzzword,
Right.
but as an intentional mechanical shift in cognitive processing. It is the shift from the frantic, predictive state of doing to the open sensory state of being.
I love how the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh articulates this in The Miracle of Mindfulness. He says, you don't need to retreat to a monastery. You can practice by simply washing the dishes. But the instruction is that you must wash the dishes just to wash the dishes.
The distinction there is profound. If you are washing the dishes merely to get them clean, you are operating entirely in the predictive mode. Your brain is focused on a future state-clean dishes, and it views the present moment, the dirty dishes, as an obstacle.
You're annoyed, you're agitated, you're rushing.
Exactly. You are generating a constant low-level prediction error because the current sensory reality doesn't match the desired future model.
But washing the dishes just to wash the dishes means intentionally dropping that top-down prediction of the future. You anchor your attention entirely on the bottom-up sensory data.
You feel the temperature of the water, you notice the texture of the soap. By dropping the prediction, you eliminate the error signal. You dissolve the friction between you and reality.
Jon Kabat-Zinn, who formalized this into Western medicine with the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program, or MBSR, he defines it perfectly. He states that mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And based on what we've just discussed about predictive processing, that word non-judgmentally is really the linchpin.
It is the biological mechanism of change. In Friston's framework, a judgment is just another top-down prediction. When you judge an experience as good or bad, you are comparing the raw sensory data to your internal model of how things should be.
And if the data doesn't fit the model, prediction error, frustration, suffering.
Therefore, to observe reality non-judgmentally is to intentionally suspend the brain's predictive machinery. You allow the raw, unedited sensory data to flow in without imposing a binary categorization onto it. You stop carving the universe into hot and cold, good and bad.
And the empirical science backing this up is incredibly robust. The Harvard Gazette study we reviewed is a perfect example of this.
Yes, Dr. Sarah Lazar's laboratory took MRIs of participants' brains before and after they completed an 8-week MBSR program. The results showed that merely 8 weeks of practicing non-judgmental awareness literally thickened the cerebral cortex.
Wait, really? Thickened it?
Yes, specifically in areas associated with executive function, attention, and emotional integration.
So it's not just a subjective feeling of calm. The brain is physically remodeling its own architecture.
It is. The constant practice of sitting with sensory reality without generating a predictive judgment strengthens the neural pathways that allow you to tolerate ambiguity. You are literally rewiring your cortical networks so that they no longer default to frantic, stressful prediction errors when the world acts unpredictably.
Let's translate this into a scenario you, the listener, might face today. Let's say you're stuck in horrific gridlock traffic. Your heart rate spikes. You're gripping the steering wheel. You're furious. Why? Because your internal model predicted an open road, and reality is violating that prediction.
Your brain is screaming with prediction errors.
Right. And mindfulness doesn't magically clear the cars. Mindfulness is sitting in the driver's seat, feeling the tension in your jaw, listening to the idling engines, and actively dropping the judgment that the traffic shouldn't be there. You recognize that the traffic simply is. You are hitting accept on reality's terms of service, thereby silencing the alarm bells in your brain.
You stop demanding that the witness change their testimony to match your pre-written verdict. You just listen.
Which pushes us toward the final ultimate question of this deep dive. Where does this actually end? If you spend your life continuously dropping rigid predictions and practicing radical acceptance, do you just become a passive zombie? Are we just training ourselves to be mindless biological machines that never try to change the world?
That is a very common misconception, but across all the traditions we've examined, the end point is actually absolute integration and flow.
Okay.
The goal isn't passive resignation. The goal is to exist fully and actively within the world, but without the cognitive drag of duality.
We see this beautifully in Christian mysticism. Meister Eckhart, the 13th century philosopher, he centered his theology around two principles: Abgeschiedenheit, meaning radical detachment, and Gelassenheit, meaning letting go.
And Eckhart's formulation here is staggering. He argued that radical detachment is actually a higher virtue than love.
Higher than love.
Yes, because love, he reasoned, still requires duality, a lover and a beloved. It implies a seeking, a reaching for something outside the self. Detachment, however, creates an absolute void within the soul. It systematically empties the mind of all self-will, all rigid expectations, all internal models.
He's clearing out the courtroom.
Completely. And Eckhart leaned on the philosophical principle that nature abhors a vacuum. If you successfully create an absolute void of ego within yourself, the divine or ultimate reality is mechanically compelled to rush in and fill it. You don't reach for reality. You make yourself utterly empty, and reality integrates with you effortlessly.
That's incredible. And the Sikh tradition maps out this exact same psychological evolution. They describe the journey from the Manmukh to the Gurmukh.
Right.
The Manmukh is the ego-centered consciousness we talked about earlier, trapped in Hamai, constantly fighting the world, bleeding metabolic energy through endless prediction errors.
The Gurmukh, conversely, has shed the armor of the ego. They no longer fracture reality into me and them. They perceive the systematic unity of Yikankar directly. But critically, they remain highly active in the world.
They don't just sit in a cave.
Exactly. They serve their community, they engage in justice, but they do it without the internal friction of attachment to the outcome.
The Indian saint Sai Baba of Shirdi codified this active engagement through two pillars: Shraddha, meaning deep faith, and Saburi, meaning active patience.
Saburi is the key concept there. It is not passive apathy. It is the conscious, disciplined choice to remain steady in the face of chaos. It is the continuous practice of surrendering the ego's demand that the universe conform to its microscopic preferences.
So to bring this all the way back to the neuroscience, what does this state of ultimate integration look like computationally?
In Friston's mathematical models, this endpoint is the ultimate minimization of free energy. It is what we commonly refer to as a flow state.
Oh, a flow state.
Yes, the organism perfectly adapts to its environment. Because your top-down predictions are no longer rigid and defensive, They become fluid. They instantly adapt to match the bottom-up sensory reality as it unfolds in real time. There is no lag. There are no massive error signals. You move through the world with supreme efficiency.
So the end goal, whether it's Eckhart's Divine Void, the Seagrump, or an optimized predictive coding network, isn't about running away to a cave. It's about engaging with everyday life with supreme agility, because you aren't carrying the heavy, exhausting armor of your own rigid expectations.
It is the freedom to participate in the complexity of the world without being at war with it.
Let's pull all these threads together for you, the listener. We started by looking for a common pattern across an incredibly diverse stack of sources, and the architecture we found is pretty undeniable.
It really is.
The esoteric illusion of separation, the Maya, the Manus Bandita, the Homai, is the exact same mechanism as the brain's predictive models. When we forcefully demand that the fluid universe fit our tiny, rigid mental boxes, we suffer massive prediction errors. And the spiritual path of detachment and surrender is identically mirrored by the neurobiological practice of mindfulness. The ultimate sweeping pattern across human history is that profound peace relies on stepping out of our own internal simulations, firing the prejudiced judge, and embracing reality on its own terms.
It is a profound synthesis. But there is a modern, rather urgent implication to this that we haven't touched on yet, and it is something I really want to leave you with.
Okay, what is it?
Well, we've established that minimizing prediction errors leads to internal peace. But we now live in an attention economy driven by algorithms that are mathematically designed to do the exact opposite. Social media platforms, news feeds, digital marketing, these systems are weaponizing prediction errors against you.
Weaponizing them.
Yes. They are engineered to constantly violate your internal models, to feed you out-of-context data that triggers massive, painful error signals in your brain. Because neurobiologically, a prediction error demands your immediate attention. It keeps you clicking, it keeps you outraged, it keeps you engaged.
Wow. If the path to freedom is stillness, the entire digital infrastructure is built to keep spinning the firebrand. It makes you wonder, how much of your daily anxiety is actually yours and how much is just a synthetic prediction error injected into your feed to keep you profitable. That is a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Carry this new lens with you today, and we'll see you next time.